in Daniel chapter 2 and 3. We'll focus on chapter 3 today. And what I want to visit with you about in this first session is how God frees us to live for what lasts. Okay? To really devote our lives to a project and to activities that bring results that never end. And so in the last session, when we were in Daniel chapter 2, we saw that there were two dynamics at play. One had to do with what's the source of insight, knowledge, revelation. And that's what we talked about last time. But the second part of that chapter had to do with what lasts and what just kind of evaporates, what's here today, gone tomorrow. And we want to pick up on that today because it continues into chapter 3 as a primary focus. You'll remember back in chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar has had this dream. And we didn't talk about the content of that dream that is revealed to Daniel so he can interpret it to him, but now we will. That dream that was so perplexing and disturbing for Nebuchadnezzar was this. He saw a giant statue that was made of composite materials. It had a head of gold. It had chest and arms that were silver. It had a belly of bronze, thighs of iron, and then you go down into the feet, and the feet were a mixture of iron and clay. And as he watched, a stone cut out without hands. That's a way of talking about something that humans were not the origin of. Okay, emerges, and although it's very small, it rolls and it takes out this huge statue. And when it runs it over, there's nothing left of it. It vanishes. It evaporates. It's dust. And then that tiny stone, not from human work, grows and fills the earth. Okay. Well, that's the dream that Nebuchadnezzar has that he can't make sense of. And I want you to think with me a little bit about the kind of the metaphors, if I can put it that way, the significance, first of all, of a statue at all. Okay. Why do people make statues? Why set up monuments? What's that about? Well, at a really basic level, that's about trying to make something permanent, or at least pretend that something that we're doing or is made will be there for a very long time. So we make monuments because we imagine generations to come looking back, and that gives us a sense that what we're doing now at this moment will last. What we see in the dream, that stone that is not a human product, right? What we see in the dream is that it's not the things that human beings do, these various kingdoms, which is the interpretation of this dream. These various kingdoms ultimately don't last, but it's going to be something that God does, something that starts out small, like this tiny stone, that ultimately will bring an end to these various human organizations and kingdoms and projects, and it will grow to fill the earth. In other words, ultimately, it's this thing that looks so small at this moment that God is doing, which will prove to actually be the goal of history. It's going to be what everything's been moving through and towards. And when we, as it were, look back from the end, we'll see that these things that looked tiny at this moment are what ultimately grew and became what lasts. Okay? Now, and so the point of this is simply to put in perspective human projects in general. What we do in purely human terms will disappear, but what God's doing is what will last. Now, Daniel delivers the interpretation of this to Nebuchadnezzar, and go to now chapter 3. of course, Daniel's been promoted and all of that. But you move to chapter 3, and what you see is Nebuchadnezzar has been told, you, O king, are the head. You're the one of gold, the kingdom of gold. And what we see here is immediately Nebuchadnezzar receives a little bit of that revelation and he twists it. Okay? Now, this is really common in how human beings make use of and misuse those insights, those revelations that come. And so as we serve in various human organizations and we do things simply for God, for his people, for the good of the people that we're interacting with, we have to expect that just because God's using us in that place with those people does not mean they're going to really understand what we're on about. Okay? And so God provides revelation, insight through Daniel, and immediately it's distorted. And so what does Nebuchadnezzar do? He says, oh, I'm the head of gold. I'm the kingdom of gold. So I'll make that permanent, right? And so he builds this giant statue of gold of himself, right? So chapter 3, verse 1, Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, the height of which was 60 cubits and its width 6. And he set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. It's interesting if you look at kind of what he's doing, even the way in which we're given the dimensions of the statue. We're supposed to be able to see through this. Like if you have something that's 60 cubits high and only 6 wide, that's not a very stable structure, right? Especially in the ancient world, right? So what he's doing is, I'm going to make something that shows my importance and shows that my significance will endure, but he does it in such a way that anybody with a lick of sense knows that thing's tumbling, right? That is not going to last long. And so he sets this up, and then he commands that all peoples, languages, nations come and bow down before this statue. And so you have kind of the demand for worshiping the image. I said we have to think about the metaphor here, and it's really important, especially in chapter 3, to think about the metaphor, because you've got kind of two alternatives that are offered in chapter 3. He says, fall down before this image and worship it, or what will happen? Thrown into this furnace of fire. So your options are worship an image or enter the flames. Okay? And first of all, let's talk about this kind of this effort to make something permanent, which is what the statue is, because that stands for one pole of human experience. Okay, one pole is you take some portion of what's out there, some piece of reality, and you try to crystallize it. You try to make it permanent. You try to imagine that this is what's ultimately real and what will make your life significant and give you stability and permanence and power. And then what you do is you bow down before it. Behind this, kind of this idle impulse, is the need, and it really is a need for human beings to pretend that we're in control. Okay? Pretend that we have some significant control over our own lives. And so we do that by taking some piece of truth, some piece of reality, and trying to absolutize it and demand that others bow down to it as well. And then the alternative is, the reason we do that is that if we don't kind of make some image that we worship, the only alternative is to enter into the flames. And that's what's going to happen. In the story, if you refuse to bow down, you'll be thrown in. But this is kind of the other pole of human experience. And so I want you to think about this. What is fire? Okay. Well, it is the least stable, right? It is the least permanent of any of the elements. It's the one that's always in motion. You can't fix it. You can't nail it down. It's always changing, and anything that you bring into it, it has a way of devouring. And so it's this kind of disorderly, form-devouring substance that it stands for the way in which in human life everything really is changing, right? And so you kind of have these two poles, these two possibilities for human beings. Is that on the one hand we take a little something that we have some control over, and we pretend that's everything, and we bow down and we insist other people bow down to it, idolatry. And just to be clear, we probably don't do it with a statue nowadays, but we have other ways of doing this, right? We maybe what we put our confidence in is a savings account, or it's a role or a position that we're in, or it's a social network, or political connections, or a family name. We have all sorts of different ways of grabbing hold of something and insisting that that is what's permanent and significant, what will last, and then essentially worshiping it. And the reason we do that is that in purely human terms, the only other alternative is to acknowledge that everything we're doing is going to vanish, right? And so in purely human terms, if you give people the option between your life is just a little bit of flux, and it's here today and it's gone tomorrow, and nothing you're doing is going to last, and you're fragile, and you have so little control over the things in your life that you're aiming at, and you're just a vapor. You give them an option between that and bowing down to the image. Every time human beings will choose the idol. Every time. Because it's just too much for human beings to bear the thought that they're a vapor, right? And so in purely human terms, those are your only options. You worship the image, you pretend, or you enter the flames, and the flames devour and destroy, and there's nothing left. Okay? But within God's kingdom, this is what we see over and over as you go through the book of Daniel, is that these kind of options that are the only thing you can have in purely human terms, in the kingdom of God, there's a third way. There's something else that's available to us. And in this case, what Daniel's three friends find is that there's this way of choosing by anchoring ourselves in God's kingdom, God's project, knowing that God alone is ultimate in what lasts. They're able to refuse to bow down, right? They can do without the idol, and they can even enter the flames, and they can do this without it destroying them. Okay, and so here's what we learn about how to live for what lasts without, and to do this by doing without the idols. The first thing that we learn here, so chapter 3, 13 and following, all the people are brought before this image. They're demanded to worship it. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they refuse, and so some of the Chaldeans bring them before the king. And verse 13 through 23, what we learn first here is that we should expect impressive attempts to turn you if you refuse to bow down, right? And disproportionate anger when you resist. So here's the words of Daniel. So Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and anger, gave orders to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and these three men were brought before the king. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I've set up?" Now, if you're ready, at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, and bagpipe, and all kinds of music, to fall down and worship the image that I've made, well, very well. But if you will not worship it, you will immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. And what God is there who could deliver you out of my hands? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give an account concerning this matter. If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire. And he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But even if he doesn't, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you've set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with wrath, and his facial expression was altered toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He answered by giving orders to heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. He commanded certain valiant warriors who were in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in order to cast them into the furnace of blazing fire. Then these men were tied up in their trousers, coats, caps, all their other clothes, and were cast into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. For this reason, because the king's command was severe and the furnace had been made extremely hot, the flame of the fire slew those men who carried Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego. But these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire, still tied up. Okay? So you can expect, if you decide not to play along, not to pretend that whatever it is that in your organization, among your friends, people are trying to put at the center of things, say this is what's most important, this is what will last. If you decide not to play along with that, you can expect to get a very, very heated response. Okay, they're gonna be angry, and there's gonna be disproportionate anger. The reason the anger is disproportionate is behind that anger is fear. People are afraid, and this is why they've set up the image in the first place. They're afraid that their lives are insignificant. Okay? They're afraid that what they're pouring themselves into will ultimately amount to nothing. And that's more than people can bear on their own. The thought that their lives would be wasted. And this is why the king responds so intensely, and so heat the fire 7 times and all of that. Now, there's a reason that people are afraid of this. It's not mistaken to be afraid. Okay? And you see this in verse 22, because the men who carry them up, they die from the flame. Okay? In purely human terms, kind of viewing your life in terms of the transience. And I mean, all you have to do is kind of widen out, and you can pick a certain number of years in which you know that everything you've done, there won't be anybody around who remembers it. Okay? And you don't have to go that far out. Right? 80 years, probably not, our names probably won't be remembered right there, You go out 500, 800, whatever, right? In purely human terms, whatever it is that we're doing right now, okay, comes and goes, okay? And so, outside of the kingdom of God, this is the fact of human life, our kind of our fragility and so forth. It's just too much for human beings to bear, and that's why we can expect these heated, hyperbolic responses from people when we don't bow down to the idols. Okay? But within the kingdom of God, what we find is that those flames really cannot harm us. Let me say something about what I mean by this. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when they don't bow down to the image, they're choosing to enter the flames. Okay? They're choosing to enter the flames. You and I think, are called, in our own lives, to choose to enter the flame, to enter into those situations and scenarios that are beyond our control, that are unpredictable as to where they're going to go, that aren't fixed. They're not predictable in the way that the statue is, right? And we're called with God to walk into those flames, to embrace the flux of what's going on. It's not exactly the flux, but it's whatever God's going to do in the midst of that flux, okay? Because contrary to all that we would expect, what lasts actually is what happens in that fire, okay? And what comes out the other side. It's not the statue. Those are gonna be destroyed. They're gonna end up, being dust. But it's what happens in the flames that turns out to be eternal. It turns out to be what lasts. And so verses 24 through 27, Nebuchadnezzar the king is astounded. He stands up in haste and he says to the high officials, "Hey, wasn't it 3 people that I threw in there? And they were tied up, right?" He says, and the man says, "Certainly, O king." Verse 25, he says, "Well, look, I see 4 unbound walking around in the midst of the fire without harm. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." Okay. And then Nebuchadnezzar came to the door of the furnace of blazing fire, and he said, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out, servants of the Most High God, come here." And when they came out of the midst of the fire, it says, all the officials are around them, and they saw that the fire had no effect, had literally no power over the bodies of these men. Their hair wasn't singed, their trousers weren't damaged, there wasn't even a smell of fire upon them. What we learn here is if you trust God enough to enter into the flames with God, okay, if you'll answer the call to walk into that unpredictable scenario that goes beyond what you feel competent for, goes beyond what you can rationally predict the outcome of, but in faithfulness walk into that. Okay, what you'll find is that the flames have no power over you. Okay, you'll find that you can face those changes. And in the midst of all of the alterations that you will undergo, you will lose nothing. You will lose nothing. And the reason you'll lose nothing is that you will find that you're not alone in those flames. Okay? That there's the 4th person with you, right? And that one that meets you in the flames is immortal and is carrying on a project that you will be joining with him in the midst of all of that change. And it will be a project that does not end. His actions are what lasts. Third thing that we learn, and then we'll kind of wrap this up, is there's one exception. I said when you enter the flames, you'll lose nothing there. That's not exactly true. There's one exception. And you see this in verses 24 and 25. When they're thrown in, they enter the flames bound. Okay? And when they get into the flames, they've lost something. But the only thing that they've lost are the ropes that bound them. Okay? And so what we find is that when in faith we answer that call and we walk into that situation that is beyond ourselves, and we embrace whatever changes that we have to face, that God meets us there, and what we end up losing in the midst of those changes turn out to only be the things that were holding us back in the first place. Okay? We learned that the things that maybe we were so frightened of being divested of, those are the things actually that were our chains, were the ropes that bound us. And so if you will choose the flames with God, you'll find that the fire burns off the things that have been holding you back. Okay?
Could you expound on that a little bit more, maybe from either a personal experience or by observation. Just kind of flesh that out a little bit more for us.
Yeah. So very often we pull back from a challenge because we don't know what would be required of us if we stepped into it, right? And so we have this tendency to replay and to do over and over the things that seem to have worked at one point, right? But part of what happens in human life is we get to the place periodically where we're doing things that we've done before and they always worked and suddenly they don't work, right? And so we have to, we find ourselves called into a situation where we're doing things that kind of are beyond our comfort zone. Example recently, when the COVID lockdown happened, I've never done anything with social media, all of that, but because of the lockdown, I had to start kind of producing lessons that were not done in person. And so I did a little series of meditations on Proverbs for YouTube. And it was just kind of a stopgap. It was something that I could do, but I was completely uncomfortable doing. And it's been really kind of bizarre and interesting to watch how God's made use of these videos and in other places. And I'm kind of getting emails and calls and so forth from people who've been following. So, I mean, that's just an example of something that was completely outside my comfort zone, something I had no competency for doing. They're not, well shot. But God's using them. And so it was something that he called me into. And coming here was like that also. We had a position that was, it was reliable, consistent, knew what I was going to do and who I was answering to and all of that. But when the call came, we knew that we needed to be here to answer without knowing everything that was going to look like. I mean, we're still discovering a lot of the particulars of what we need to do here, right? Okay. But we've walked into those flames, and when we look back, we see we left things. I mean, there was loss, but the things that were lost, we feel in many ways have been things that it turned out to be good for us to lose. As hard as it was to let go of them, it turned out that was good. And there's a kind of a freedom now as we walk into this, though we don't know exactly where everything's going. And so I don't know if that's concrete enough.
I think as we all, and even the people watching this, discuss this more, the idea of this, I like the way you describe the flames. Sometimes the flames are generated by people who are putting pressure on us to conform. And I wonder, the temperature of the flame sometimes may depend upon my own fear.
Yes.
And so I'm participating in the heat of the furnace, I guess, in some ways, and even how that works. And I think that might be good for us to reflect on. It's just identifying what is that. What's the pressure I'm feeling, but also the fear I'm bringing to the moment. And I think that's something we can learn from these three men that I'm sure they were not interested to walk into this flame because they understood what that meant, but so they were taking their own fear and what they would generate into that situation. But anyway, I appreciate that. Your comment on that. It kind of helps us imagine what is it that is pushing us, and then what is also we're taking with us into that furnace.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thanks, Bill. Part of what comes to mind was a scenario. This is going back a decade or more now, but when it was at a point where I started to get more invitations to go talk and teach in places, and there were several scenarios, kind of one after another, where I found myself suddenly under attack or criticism from people that I didn't know and hadn't had any personal interaction with. In one case, it was simply the title of my lesson that had been advertised in a place, and somebody kind of wrote a letter wanting to warn people about the heresy coming to them. And part of what happened in that was I realized that if how can I put this? If I was unable to kind of graciously receive hostilities and respond not in kind, right?
Mm-hmm.
If I couldn't live beyond that, and if I couldn't get beyond a certain level of sensitivity where I was just so crushed by that, then what God could do with me in his project would be severely limited. Just because I'd break down, I wouldn't be of use if I couldn't handle some of that. And so that was kind of a call to walk into the flames there. And part of the flame certainly was my own need for others' approval and things like that. And so one of the things that we have to set down if we're going to kind of reject idols and enter the flames instead with God is a need for others to approve, because that always leads back to idolatry.
Yeah,
It always
the
does.
permanence that you're showing us.
Yeah, because then we have to kind of create those images that we're trying to live up to and get others to believe is what we really are and what we're really